My name's Pixie and this is the Pixie Diaries, where I talk about books that I've read. Today I'm going to be doing my May wrap-up, even though it's already halfway into June. In May, I participated in Cindy's 2022 Asian Readathon. I read 6 different books by 6 different Asian authors, and I'm going to be talking about which books I read in the order that I read them. May was actually a really good reading month for me, and there was only one book that I didn't really like. All of the other ones were at least 4 stars or above. Some of the books I didn't give ratings, not because I didn't enjoy them, but because I felt it was hard to place a kind of arbitrary signifier of how much I enjoyed the book. Still, at the end of this video, I will be ranking the books based on my own personal enjoyment of them. This doesn't mean anything about whether the book was good or not, just, I guess, based on what exactly I was in the mood to read, and also how much it kind of excited me personally while I was reading them. So the first book that I read for the Asian Readathon was Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. This is a multi-generational story, so it's kind of hard to discuss who the main characters are because the focus of the story changes from each kind of era, but it's mostly contained within one family and the different people that they interact with along their journey from Korea to Japan. Basically, it's a story about displaced Koreans, those who were displaced from Korea because of Japanese colonialism, and subsequently, after World War II, the Korean War. And it's also about these same Koreans who are displaced even within Japan. So because of colonial rule and because of the kind of long-lasting consequences of the colonial rule, a lot of people who live in Japan, who can trace maybe their ancestry back to Korea, are not considered Japanese citizens. Because of this, even if, say, a person was born in Japan and raised in Japan and knew only Japanese, and even their parents were born and raised in Japan, and maybe even their grandparents, if somewhere down the line they could trace their lineage back to Korea, usually during the colonial period, they wouldn't be considered Japanese citizens and would have to be registered as Koreans or as foreign nationals. This kind of idea of quote-unquote undesirables within Japan is really explored, not just with the Koreans or the descendants of Koreans, but also with other Japanese people who aren't considered to be proper citizens. Those whose employment or lifestyles are considered like, what is it? Not marginalized, but not discriminated. Oh my gosh, what is it called? Oh, I don't remember. What is it? Because of the kind of vastness of the topic that's approached here, as well as the amount of characters that we follow and get perspectives from, as well as the fact that the entire novel kind of spans multiple decades, so it starts kind of in the 1920s and goes into the 1980s, it's really hard to explain succinctly, especially without giving away spoilers, the plot of this story, but believe me when I say that you should totally pick it up. I personally love multi-generational stories, even though I've only read a couple. I read Homegoing by Yagyasi a couple years ago, and I really, really enjoyed it. What's really impressive about these multi-generational stories, and what was really impressive to me about Pachinko, is the clear display of skill from the author to be able to capture this many perspectives and give them all unique voices and struggles, even though a lot of them shared common themes, like the idea of displacement, the consequences of colonialism, the problem of trying to raise money or to earn money in a place that sees you as less than human, to be able to provide for your family and the kind of sacrifices that you'll make to be able to do that. That kind of plays throughout the novel, but still you get all these different characters and all their different approaches to said themes. I was generally just quite impressed at the kind of scope of it, how large and oh my gosh, there's so much noise outside today. So I was just generally impressed by the author's ability to weave this kind of larger story throughout the decades and with reference to all these different characters as they grow up and have children of their own. And we follow those children and their children's children. What I most liked about it is that I am personally interested in that period of Japanese and Korean history. Even though I've done research on my own, mostly for school, I still learned a lot of new things when reading this book. Had a really strong emotional core, and I was affected like I would be affected by any other fiction book. But I still learned a lot about the history of that time. I'm not normally a fan of historical fiction, but this was definitely worth it, and I'm so happy to all the people who recommended it to me because it is one of those books that everyone tells you to read, and when you read it, you're like, yeah, I understand why. Actually, while I was reading it, there was one thing that I was a little bit confused by. Basically, you know how the name of the book is Pachinko? I was about 50% of the way into the book before the connection to Pachinko became more apparent for how the story of this one family becomes intertwined with the world of Pachinko. And I found that it was a really interesting device, I guess, to use. Mostly because it really fit in with the discussion about political identity and cultural identity, because pachinko is something that is kind of a cultural staple of Japan. It's incredibly popular, but it has these kind of associations with criminality. And in the book, you find out that a lot of Koreans, or people considered Koreans because of their ancestry, were allowed to work in the pachinko business exactly because of this association. If they were successful, they would make a lot of money just because of how popular pachinko is in Japan. But it's still, no matter how much money they made, this kind of criminal association and discrimination that comes along with it always sticks to them. I'm not sure how long I can go on talking about this book just because there's so much that goes on in it. Like, it really is very hefty, not necessarily in the size of it, but it's more so that it's just so dense with so many events that happen and so many just like characters, and relationships. But reading it, I never felt overwhelmed. I really knew who each character was, like their primary motivations and their personalities and things like that. And I'm just really, really impressed with Min Jin Lee's work. And I know it must have taken so many years of research to be able to write it. And I just really commend her hard work. So the next book that I read was Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. This is a Japanese novella, and I would consider it literary fiction. Basically, we follow this woman. She's around in her 30s and has been working at the same convenience store for 18 years. Even though our circumstances are so different, I found that this story really spoke to me, and I think the reason why I enjoyed it so much is because I read it at exactly the right time. Without getting too personal about it, recently I got really, really burnt out with university and academic life. And as a result, I was left kind of questioning this specific life path that I felt kind of socially pressured to accept as the only thing that I could do with my life. The standard, after you graduate from high school, go straight to university, and graduate from university, find appropriate job for the degree that you got, stuff like that, where I felt like I only had one path that I could take. And rather than decide on whether or not that path is truly for me, I just kind of accepted it as the only thing that I could do because of having read this book at the same time that I was questioning these things. I've really begun to just evaluate what I actually want to do with my life and what I desire in life. And I found that this novella really spoke to that feeling. The protagonist has this like acute awareness of all these unspoken social rules that exist in our society, and specifically in her case, in Japanese society. So, this idea that as a woman, you have to be married and have to have kids and have to have a proper job, working at a convenience store, especially as a part timer, which she is, at a non management level, is kind of considered to be not a proper job. But she kind of realizes at the end of the novella something that she's almost always known is that she truly loves working at the convenience store, being content with the fact that maybe your life isn't exactly how it's supposed to be, but if you're happy with the way it is, that's all that matters. And I think it seems kind of mundane, but I found it to be a really powerful message. And I think part of the reason why I really like this novella is also because I watched Everything Everywhere All at Once. I think before I read it, it was like shortly before I read it. Although the film tackles a lot of different themes, like the relationships between queer children and parents that struggle to accept or understand them, and things like depression and feeling really, really just overwhelmed and not knowing what to do with it and how to deal with it. There was also this feeling that this main character of the film, Evelyn, that she kind of is living this mediocre life. She runs a laundromat with her husband who wants a divorce and her daughter who she has kind of a strained relationship with. And it's kind of like her coming to terms with the fact that this is the life she lives and that she contains multitudes as a person and that she can be happy and kind of like choose love and how important love is and how important just accepting where you are in life and knowing that that's good enough. It just, I feel like watching that film and then reading this book, it really reassured me because I was kind of having a little bit of a meltdown, breakdown just about my future, even though I'm so young, because you just are so stuck in this idea that you have to go to college and you have to graduate in 4 years. You can never take a break. You can never slow down. Even after you graduate, you have to find a good enough job to live by yourself. It's all these pressures, especially considering I kind of pushed myself through high school as well. And when you add on top of that, like mental illness and things like that, it becomes really quite overwhelming. And I felt like both the film and this novella dealt with those kind of societal problems and also like personal development issues in a way that felt really relevant to me and really powerful and just super emotional. And just, even though I wanted to cry, it was also a really, really hopeful message and felt like something like, it's okay, I got this, and I still have time, and I still, like, it was so reassuring. I would really recommend it to anyone who hasn't read it yet. It's very short, so I think you could read it really quickly, and I definitely recommend it to people like me who have kind of had breakdowns or like any kind of life crisis where you're stuck wondering what you want in life and where to go from here, I would really recommend this book. This book did come really, really highly recommended to me. Actually, right after I finished this book and returned it to the library, one of my friends came to my flat and actually gave me the book to borrow, and I just had to say to her, I'm sorry, but I actually just read this book, but I think I might actually buy it if I can find a cover that I really like and an edition that I really like. I'd love to add it to my collection because this is one of those books that I would just love to lend out to people, and I highly, highly recommend it, and I understand why it's so highly recommended as well. The next book that I read was Burnt Sugar by Avni Doshi, and I found this book to be incredibly poetic. The language that she uses is really, really visual and kind of sensory, almost bodily. Everything that was described just felt like it was almost leaping off the page and just surrounding you, and you really felt like invested in the story because it was almost like you were in it. Like you could almost touch all the textures and everything. It's kind of hard to describe what this book is about, but kind of a basic description, I guess, is that it's about a mother and daughter relationship, one that is quite dysfunctional and also has like really complex, nuanced feelings of just like, a traditional dysfunctional mother-daughter relationship. Things like this kind of resentment, but also a really strong feeling of connection, like you are the same person as your mother, and also just feelings of protectiveness because you understand that your mother has gone through a lot, but also this feeling of just despair at becoming like your mother, or even just like this idea that there is no one who understands you as much, but also because she understands you so much, she can be the most cruel. It's just like a big ball of complicated feelings, and the author explores this in a really interesting way. Like she plays with time in a way that I found kind of fucked with my brain reading it. So if you're a person who really doesn't like unconventional uses of time or narrative, then I wouldn't really suggest reading this. I gave this book 4 stars, and personally, I would recommend it to anyone who has a complicated relationship with their mother. Just like basically, if you liked the film Lady Bird, you should read this book. In terms of the interesting ways in which time was explored, it was explored through memory and kind of the fallibility of memory, the ways in which we remember things differently to how they actually happened, or how we can kind of contort the memories that we have to be ones that we agree with or that make us feel better about ourselves. So the main way in which memory is used in this story is through the mother's kind of memory loss condition. In her older age, she kind of develops like dementia or a type of Alzheimer's, where she just starts to forget things. Like she sometimes even forgets who her daughter is. She confuses her son-in-law for her own husband, things like this. But there's also a different way in which memory is explored, which I found really fascinating, and it's through the daughter's artistic practice. So, without spoiling too much, the daughter is an artist, and one of these like series that she does is she draws the same face over and over and over again, and like basically every day draws the same face. And in her final collection, she has these 365 charcoal drawings of the same face, and you kind of see how it evolves over time, and how even when you're doing the same thing, all these little changes create a kind of bigger change, I guess. It's a very elementary understanding of it, but I found it really, really fascinating. Later on, I'm going to be talking about the Atlas 6, since that was the last book I read for this readathon. But I will just say now, the way in which Parisa talks about memory or using memory as a form of time travel really reminded me of the ways in which this book tackled memory and the past and like constructions of the past and our understanding of time. My personal experience with time reading this book, it just felt like time was constantly shrinking and expanding as the narrative hops around both the daughter's and the mother's kind of timeline of events or their past memories. And at one point, it becomes almost like they are the same person, or the like boundary between the two becomes more permeable, and it's almost as if they kind of bleed into each other, which I really, really loved. So, if you're interested in those kinds of almost confusing novels, I would definitely recommend this one. So, the next book that I read is called A Lover's Discourse by Shalu Guo. It's apparently based on a Roland Barthes text by the same name. What I found interesting about the organization of this book is that it's split up into a series of vignettes or kind of snapshots into the life of our main character. This woman's relationship with this British man, or actually, it's kind of confusing because he's Australian and German, but he has been living in the UK for a while. I don't actually remember exactly, mostly just because I found him to be a bit boring and their relationship to be the least interesting thing about this novel. I did enjoy it, but I enjoyed it more for the perspective of our main character as a Chinese immigrant and during the time of Brexit, and also specifically because of her PhD work in visual anthropology. Anthropology is something that I am interested in, and visual anthropology is also something I was more interested to learn about because I am a film major, and that's kind of like similar to what documentarians do. Rather than her relationship with this man, which I literally can't remember his name, I found her research subject to be the most interesting part of this novel. So, throughout her research, she kind of discusses this idea of originality as a colonial fetish, specifically originality or the concept of it in the art world. Because of the kind of loosely connected nature of the organization of this book, I felt like not liking some of the chapters didn't really detract from my reading experience as a whole. I just felt like if I read a chapter, which, by the way, they're quite short, some of them are only a couple pages long. I felt like if I read a chapter that I didn't like, it's not necessarily indicative of whether I'll like the next chapter. This might be something that'll put people off from reading it just because, it's kind of like playing Russian roulette with whether or not you're going to like the next chapter, and you kind of can't depend on the previous chapters to kind of give you that expectation. Personally, towards the end, I was kind of losing steam with reading this book, but because it was so easy to read and because it was so quick to read, I just kept pushing through. It was just that after her PhD research is completed and she gets her doctorate, I found that the relationship and I felt that compared to her personal opinions and personal research on mechanical reproduction, which is, I think, a concept termed by Walter Benjamin, and just like all these like philosophical and anthropological discussions and questions, I felt like the relationship itself was definitely more, I guess, just more boring to me. I liked the main character, but I didn't like her love interest that much, and I didn't really care for their kind of dynamic as a couple. But yeah, I guess I would say I did enjoy this book and I would recommend it to people, but obviously, if you're not really into this kind of vignette style of writing for novels, I would say don't read it. Apologies if the lighting is a bit different. My camera battery died, so I had to wait a couple hours for it to charge. The next book that I read was A World Without Princes by Soman Chainani. It is book 2 of a series called The School for Good and Evil. So this book is a fantasy book, and I'm not really sure whether it's YA or middle grade. Based on the way that it read, particularly the kind of jokes that were written in, I'm pretty sure it's middle grade, but it actually might be YA. I'm not sure, mostly because those kind of age categories are arbitrary anyway. But because of it, it kind of like dampened my experience since the jokes didn't really land for me and I found them to be quite juvenile and a little bit annoying rather than actually funny or engaging. It was like my dislike for the jokes, or like the way I didn't find them funny at all, actually kind of took me out of the story. I did enjoy the first book of the series, but with this sequel, I think I'm not going to continue it anymore. I found that the kind of binaryism in the sequel, obviously between good and bad, but that was a thing that existed in the first book, but more so between boys and girls, just felt a little odd. I understand it's not really like pushing biological essentialism necessarily, but it does feel kind of strange and just uncomfortable as someone who is non binary. The basic premise for this sequel is that instead of having a school for good and a school for evil, it's actually a school for girls, which they're hosted in the good tower, and a school for boys, which are hosted in the like evil tower. I felt like the way that challenging gender norms was approached in this book felt a bit anti-feminist to me and a little bit regressive in gender politics, especially with this treatment of this one character called Beatrice. Rather than having to be super pretty and like defining what beauty even means, which in this case, they're rejecting the idea of female beauty through the male gaze and are instead embracing things that are more gender non-conforming. Like, for example, short hair, like not wearing dresses, things like that. It just felt like odd that Beatrice, who is seen as really embracing these really gender non-conforming and quite powerful rejections of like patriarchy, is kind of seen as rejecting her true nature. Like later on in the book, we find out that Beatrice is actually really wants to like be like she used to be, have like this really beautiful long hair and wear these dresses and like wear makeup and stuff like that and really conform to this feminine ideal of beauty that comes from like patriarchy. And obviously there's nothing wrong with girly girls, but generally when it comes to the way that this was written, it was less so there's nothing wrong with being feminine and more so people who are gender nonconforming aren't really gender nonconforming and they actually have essential like gender essentialist desires, like essentialist desires to present in a specific mode of femininity, which I found kind of disappointing. And I don't think the author really meant it that way, but at least that's how I read it. And I think part of that is because I do a lot of research about gender for school and just for my personal interest. And since it's something I like think about a lot, it was kind of grating or like, it was like all I could see about the book. I don't know. It's hard to explain without sounding like a thesis paper. I just wanted to say I didn't like it. I liked the mystery aspect of it, which, to be fair, is the thing I enjoyed the most about the last book. Another reason I'm not continuing with the series is because the way in which Agatha and Sophie's relationship is characterized, I felt like there were some kind of romantic undertones there. But then I was actually spoilered for something that happens or that is revealed later on in the series, which I'm going to say now. Apparently, Agatha and Sophie are twins, and I didn't know that when I started the series, and I feel a little disturbed by the fact that I could like pick up some very obvious romantic undertones in their relationship. I think I will be reading more books from this author. I think one of his Beauty and the Beast retellings is on hold for me at my library, and I think I'm going to get it in like a couple months. So I'll check that out, and I won't be writing off this author entirely. I just will be discontinuing this series. The next book that I read for this month was The Atlas Six by Olivia Blake. I'm gonna be honest, I don't actually know how to pronounce her name because there's an E at the end and not an A. So it sounds like I'm saying Olivia Blake, but I'm saying Olivier or Olivie Blake. I'm not sure. I should have done research before this. Oh my god, my back hurts so much. The basic premise of this book is that 6 medians, who are basically the most powerful magic users, with the rarest powers, are invited to join the society that is basically the library of, or that has access to the Library of Alexandria. Although 6 of them are invited, only 5 are to be actually inducted into the society. I honestly didn't know that much about the plot of the book, just that it was really, really popular online, especially on TikTok. And this is because me and my friends went to a Waterstones a couple weeks ago, and we were just kind of looking through the bookshelves, and we passed the YA section, or we spent some time in the YA section, and I passed a copy of the Atlas 6, and it had one of those really, really annoying fake stickers on them. You know, the ones where it's just like, it's a circle, and it looks like a sticker that you can just peel off, but it's just part of the book cover. And it said like the viral TikTok sensation or something. But because I don't have TikTok, I didn't really know what to expect from the book. I knew that it was dark academia, but since that's kind of such a ambiguous term, I didn't really know what it was going to be about. I knew that it was like the secret society, and I knew that it was magic, and I knew that there was an Asian character because it came up when I looked for the Asianreadathon books, like recommendations. But aside from that, I didn't really know what to expect, and I honestly think that was a good thing because I was blown away by the book and I just had so much fun reading it. This was a 5-star read, and to be honest, it's like the first book that I've read in a really, really long time that has kind of captured the same excitement I had while reading it. Like, I was genuinely so happy while reading it. Like, I sometimes have a hard time finishing books that I really, really enjoy because I keep stopping them because I'm like, I don't want this experience to end. And also, I need time for myself to kind of feel the feelings that I'm feeling. I know that's a little confusing, but basically, while reading this book, I would often stop just to like squeal. Like, I felt like a child again. It was awesome. I don't have basically any issues with this book. I loved it, loved it, loved it so much. I was hooked basically from the beginning, but more so when Nico's first chapter came up, I was just like, I'm in. I'm in for the rest of this book. I'm in for whatever next comes. You know, I'm in for this sequel that's coming out later this year. I'm just so, so excited to see where this is going. I loved it so much. I loved the world building. I loved the characters. It's been a while since I've read a book where I've genuinely enjoyed reading each character's perspective like this. Originally, I was most interested in Reina, Callum, and Parissa's chapters, mostly because I thought their powers were the most interesting or just my favorite types of powers, or I liked their personalities. But as the story went on and as the characters kind of developed away from the like outside world and kind of stuck with each other, I began to enjoy a lot of the other perspectives to the point where all of the perspectives became kind of equal to me in terms of enjoyment. Like, especially with Tristan and Libby at the beginning, I kind of felt like about them and about their perspectives. I was like, they're all right, but I'm just waiting for the next time a Callum chapter or next time a Parissa chapter comes up. But then towards maybe like the second part or the third part of the book, I was like obsessed. I became obsessed with Libby and Tristan. If you've read the book, you know why. But yeah, I loved all the perspectives. I loved all the characters. But I must say that while I love all the main cast, my favorites are side characters, which is kind of an eternal problem of mine that I always end up enjoying or like liking characters or groups or teams or whatever that are not the main. Like they're just to the side and they don't get as much, time as the other characters, but I'm still super attached to them. And in the case of the Atlas Six, that is definitely true for Gideon. He is my favorite character if I had to pick one, and he's only in Nico's chapters and like sometimes not, because Nico has other things going on. Although I think he might be in every Nico chapter if I'm not mistaken. So Gideon is my favorite character. I will preface that by saying I ship Nico Gideon. I am a Nico Gideon truther. I will die for Nico Gideon. Like, sorry, that's the truth for me, you know? And I think part of it is just because I love their dynamic so much. And I love the fact, like, the way they communicate with each other. And I love the way they, like, switch languages and just, they're just so caring for each other. And I think what I find so beautiful about the dynamic is that it's reveals something about Nico that you don't really see otherwise. You see it later on with Nico and Libby, like the ways in which Nico obviously cares for Libby and cares for her health and safety and vice versa. But you just see this like softer side of Nico that I was honestly not expecting, especially from the way that Libby describes him in the first chapter. I always thought, oh, he's going to be like this cocky, self-assured, privileged guy. But like when you really understand the depths to which he goes to and the kind of extent to which he pushes his own body and like his magical powers and just, like his literal life, he puts his life on the line to protect Gideon. Like, if that's not true love, I have no idea what is. Like, I don't want to spoil it, so I'm not going to say, but if you've read the book, you know. So, that's all I'm saying. So one thing I do want to see change in the sequel is the characterization of Reina. I just felt like she was the most underdeveloped of this book, especially her powers. I felt like we got a kind of glimpse at what her powers are like and also what her family life was like and how that affects her disposition towards magic and towards like recruitment into like magical institutions and stuff. But I just felt like we were barely scratching the surface compared to how we're exploring these other characters. I also do want to see Tristan's powers develop more because we just got like a hint of what he can truly do. And I think that's something that we're going to see in the sequel. And speaking of things that I think we're going to see in the sequel, there is this kind of thread that Blake leaves out for us to like want to tug at, which is Dalton and his like past. And that's part of the reason I loved Paris's chapter so much is because I also really, really like Dalton. And I want to learn more about him, also because I find his powers to be really, really interesting and kind of more unique than some of the other ones. Because although they are the most rare powers, it's kind of, some of them are a little more basic in the sense of the wider fantasy genre. I think the powers I was most confused by were definitely Parisa's. I understood the whole telepath thing, and I understand that she is able to manipulate people through reading their minds, not necessarily injecting like new thoughts into their minds, like through her powers, but more so by using just like general manipulation tactics with the added knowledge of what they're actually thinking. But I guess the thing I found the most confusing was the astral projection thing. I just didn't really understand it, or I'm not sure if it was even astral projection, but I think they used the word projection, and that's one of those things where I don't really understand the scientific basis behind it. And since the whole idea behind the Atlas 6 like magic system is that it's like more scientific, I guess I was just a little confused. It just felt like pure magic, high fantasy stuff. But it's not really something that detracts from my experience of the book overall, just because, I really love the book. Also, I won't spoil it, but I will say that the twist of the book was genuinely quite surprising. I thought that I had figured it out myself, and I've kind of figured out a part of it, but it was like not at all what I was expecting in full. And it was like we were given hints, and I'm sure like when I reread it, which I'm going to be doing because I want to be buying a hardcover version for my collection, I'll notice all these little tidbits that like Blake left throughout the novel, and I'll just be like, oh, of course, this was the reveal, and blah blah blah. But yeah, I'm really happy with the twist, and I'm super super excited about the sequel. Finally, I am going to be ranking the books that I read in May. So at number 6, we have A World Without Princes. This one's pretty self-explanatory. It's just the only book I read in May that I didn't like, and it made me want to stop reading the series. So, yeah. At number 5, we have A Lover's Discourse. This one is not because I didn't enjoy it, but just because out of all the other books I read, this is the one I enjoyed less of, especially because it was one main aspect of the book that I was continuing to read it for, and that aspect of the book wasn't even really like a primary aspect of it, since the relationship was definitely foregrounded for most of the book, and that was part of it that I didn't really get invested in. But it's higher than A World Without Princes just because I really did love the questions that were raised with her PhD research, and it's definitely something that I'll be looking into for myself. At number 4, we have Burnt Sugar. This is just because I read so many good books in May that some of these books are going to be lower, even though to me they're really, really, really good books and I would be recommending to people, and this is one of them. But just compared to the other books that I read, I just enjoyed this one a little bit less, or in my personal like ranking system, which is not really organized at all. This one is just a bit lower and a bit less something that I like devoured than the other books. At number 3, we have Convenience Store Woman. So I think part of the reason why this is lower than the other books, even though to me it's something that was really emotionally resonant and just something that I really needed to read at the time that I read it, is because it is short. And I think it's one of those books that it's just there's less of it to enjoy, and so I kind of rank it lower. But in my heart of hearts, this is just really, really, really good book, and I'm really, really thankful for it, and thankful for having read it exactly at the time when I needed to. At number 2, we have Pachinko. The only reason this is number 2 and not number 1 is just because while I enjoyed reading it very, very, very much, I learned a lot from it, and I found the prose to be incredibly engaging and insightful and really, really powerful. Like, I stopped and I cried a couple times while reading this book. It's just a little bit less, I guess, exciting than my number 1 pick, which makes sense. I guess it's more like it's less entertaining, but that's not something that I hold against the book, just because the book deals with a lot of really, really heavy topics. I mean, it's a book about colonialism and World War II and like political and like national displacement and identity. So it really makes sense that there's not as much entertainment. And I don't think there should be, but it's just because while reading it, I didn't have the same kind of emotional reaction as my number 1 pick, but I still really, really love this book, and I would recommend it to anyone. At number 1, of course, we have The Atlas 6, and yeah, it's a 5-star read for me. I am really, really invested in the story, in the characters, in the world building, in the series. Even though it's only the first book, I just cannot wait for the sequel to be released, and I will be reading, I think it's a novella. I think it's like number 1.5, something like that. I will be reading that, and I might even be reading another one of her books. I think it's called Alone with You in the Ether. I know that's becoming really, really popular now, that the Atlas 6. has been picked up as a traditionally published book, and since this talk of the sequel is coming out and everything. But I will definitely be reading more of her work, and I'm just really, really excited to see where this story is going. All right, that's all for this video. Thank you so much for listening to me talk about books for however long this video is going to be. I really, really appreciate you sticking around until the end, and I would love to know if you are reading anything new and exciting and just anything that makes you just happy to be reading. All right, thank you so much. Bye.